The blade had been meant for his throat, but Garrett Xavier threw himself sideways and felt the edge bite deep into his shoulder instead, sending hot blood streaming down his chest as he crashed through the underbrush and tumbled into the ravine below. He hit the ground hard, vision swimming, and when the world stopped spinning, he found himself staring up at an unfamiliar section of forest, far from the merchant caravan he had been guarding. Pain radiated through his body in waves, and he pressed his hand against the wound, feeling warm blood pulse between his fingers. The bandits would be coming down after him soon to finish what they had started, and in his condition, he would not last long against them. He forced himself to move, dragging his body across the forest floor toward a cluster of rocks that might offer some concealment. Every movement sent fresh agony through his shoulder, and he left a trail of blood behind him like breadcrumbs leading straight to where he crawled. His vision blurred again and he collapsed against the stones, breathing hard, knowing that this might be where his story ended. 26 years old, and he would die in some nameless stretch of wilderness, his body left for the scavengers. The sound of heavy footfalls made him grip the hilt of his sword, though he doubted he had the strength left to swing it. But the footsteps passed by his hiding spot, the bandits apparently unwilling to follow him this deep into the forest. He heard them shouting to each other, arguing about whether he was worth pursuing, and then gradually their voices faded as they retreated back toward the road. Garrett let his head fall back against the rock, relief washing over him even as darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. He must have lost consciousness, because when awareness returned the sun had shifted position in the sky and the forest around him had gone quiet. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, bone-aching pain, and when he looked down, he saw that his shirt was completely soaked through with blood. He needed to stop the bleeding, or he would die here regardless of whether the bandits returned. With shaking hands, he tried to tear a strip from his shirt, but the fabric was too wet, and his fingers too weak to manage it. That was when he heard the second set of footsteps, lighter than the bandits but still purposeful, moving through the underbrush with the confidence of someone who knew these woods well. Garrett tried to raise his sword but managed only to knock it against the stone with a dull clang. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then a figure emerged from between the trees, and Garrett's breath caught in his throat. She was an orc, unmistakably so, with skin the color of spring moss and two small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw. She wore rough spun clothing that spoke of a hard life in the wilderness, and her dark hair was bound back in a practical braid that fell across one shoulder. Her eyes were a striking amber color, and they went wide when she saw him lying there against the rocks. His blood pooled on the ground around him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, human and orc, both equally surprised by the encounter. Then she took a step backward, her hand moving to the hunting knife at her belt. Garrett knew what she must be thinking. Humans and orcs had been enemies for generations, their peoples locked in a cycle of raids and reprisals that had left deep scars on both sides. If she killed him here, no one would ever know. It would be one less human to threaten her people. But instead of drawing her knife, she hesitated, her gaze moving from his face to the wound on his shoulder and back again. He could see the conflict playing out across her features, and when she finally spoke, her voice was rough but not unkind. "You are dying," she said, stating the obvious. Garrett tried to respond, but his mouth had gone dry. He managed only a weak nod. The orc woman stood there for another long moment, clearly warring with herself over what to do. Then, with what seemed like great reluctance, she stepped forward and knelt beside him. Her hands moved to his shoulder, pulling back the blood-soaked fabric to examine the wound. He hissed in pain at her touch, and she shot him a sharp look. "Be still," she commanded. "The cut is deep, but it has not taken anything vital. You will live if the bleeding stops." She stood again, and Garrett thought she might leave him there after all. But instead she moved away only far enough to gather handfuls of moss from the nearby rocks and what looked like medicinal herbs from the forest floor. When she returned, she pressed the moss against his wound with firm, practiced pressure. It hurt like fire, and Garrett could not suppress a groan. "I said be still," she repeated, but there was less edge to her voice this time. As she worked, Garrett studied her face. She could not have been much older than 20, with strong features and a determined set to her jaw. There was intelligence in those amber eyes, and something else he could not quite name. Wariness, certainly, but also a kind of tired resignation, as if she had seen too much hardship in her young life already. "Why are you helping me?" he managed to ask through gritted teeth. She did not answer immediately, keeping her attention focused on packing the wound with moss and herbs. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "I do not know," she admitted. "Perhaps I am foolish." The makeshift bandage helped, but blood still seeped through, and the orc woman made a frustrated sound low in her throat. She glanced down at her own clothing, but her rough tunic would not tear easily, and she seemed reluctant to damage it. Then her eyes moved to what remained of Garrett's shirt, the sections that were not completely soaked through with blood. Without a word, she reached down and gripped the hem of his shirt, and before he could protest, she had torn a long strip from it. The movement jostled his injured shoulder and he gasped, but she paid no attention to his discomfort as she fashioned the fabric into a proper bandage. It was only when she had tied it off that she seemed to realize what she had done, using the clothing of a human to save that same human's life. The irony was not lost on either of them. "There," she said, sitting back on her heels. "That should hold until you can reach a healer." Garrett knew there was no healer within miles, but he nodded his thanks anyway. The bleeding had slowed to a manageable trickle, and though he felt weak from blood loss, the immediate danger had passed. The orc woman stood, and for a moment he thought she would leave, her obligation fulfilled, but instead she remained standing over him with an uncertain expression. "Can you walk?" she asked. Garrett tried to push himself upright and managed to get halfway before his strength gave out, and he collapsed back against the rocks. The orc woman made another frustrated sound, and he could not tell if her frustration was directed at him or at herself for caring whether he could walk or not. "I will manage," he lied. "You will die if I leave you here," she said bluntly. "The forest has predators that will smell your blood." She was right, of course. In his weakened state, he would be easy prey for any number of dangerous creatures that prowled these woods. The thought of being torn apart by wolves or worse made him shudder. But what was the alternative? He could not expect an orc to care for him further than she already had. The orc woman seemed to be having the same internal debate. She looked around the forest as if seeking guidance from the trees themselves, then down at him again. Finally, with what sounded like a resigned sigh, she bent and hooked her arm under his good shoulder. "I am going to regret this," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Come. My shelter is not far. You can rest there until you are stronger." Garrett wanted to argue, to tell her that he could not possibly impose on her hospitality, but the truth was he had no better options. So he allowed her to help him to his feet, biting back a cry of pain as the movement sent fresh agony lancing through his shoulder. She was stronger than she looked, bearing much of his weight as they began to move through the forest. He tried to keep pace, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and more than once he stumbled and nearly brought them both down. "Your name," he managed to gasp out as they walked. "What is your name?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. Then, reluctantly, she said, "Kreshna." "I am Garrett," he offered in return. "Thank you, Kreshna, for helping me." She made a non-committal sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been regret, and they continued in silence. The shelter turned out to be a small cave tucked into the side of a wooded hillside, its entrance partially concealed by hanging vines and underbrush. Inside it was dry and surprisingly well organized, with a fire pit near the entrance and various supplies stacked neatly along the walls. Kreshna guided him to a rough pallet made of furs and helped him lie down, and the relief of being horizontal again was so intense that Garrett felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Rest," Kreshna commanded, and this time he was in no condition to argue. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the day wore into evening. Sometimes he was aware of Kreshna moving around the cave, tending the fire or checking his bandages. Other times he was lost in fevered dreams where bandits chased him through an endless forest, and he could never run fast enough to escape. When he finally surfaced to full wakefulness, night had fallen, and the cave was lit only by the warm glow of the fire. Kreshna sat near the entrance, her back against the cave wall, watching him with those unsettling amber eyes. When she saw he was awake, she rose and brought him a water skin, holding it to his lips so he could drink. The water was cold and sweet, and he drank deeply before falling back against the furs. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough. "Most of a day," she replied. "You lost much blood. You need to rest." "I cannot stay here," he protested weakly. "I am putting you in danger just by being here." "You are in no condition to leave," Kreshna said firmly, "and I will decide what dangers I accept." There was steel in her voice that brooked no argument, and Garrett found he lacked the energy to fight her anyway. Instead, he studied her face in the firelight, noting the way the flames cast shadows across her features and made her green skin seem to glow from within. She was beautiful, he realized with some surprise, in a way that had nothing to do with human standards of beauty and everything to do with the fierce pride and strength that radiated from her. As if sensing his scrutiny, Kreshna turned away and busied herself with something near the fire. When she returned, she carried a wooden bowl filled with some kind of broth, and the smell of it made Garrett's stomach clench with hunger. She helped him sit up enough to eat, and though the movement sent fresh pain through his shoulder, he managed to get most of the broth down. It was savory and rich, made with wild herbs and what tasted like rabbit meat, and it was the best thing he had ever tasted. "You are a good cook," he said, and was rewarded with the ghost of a smile. "I have had much practice," Kreshna replied. "One learns to make do with what the forest provides." "You live out here alone." The smile vanished and her expression closed off. "Yes." There was clearly a story there, but Garrett knew better than to press. Instead, he finished the broth in silence and allowed her to help him lie back down. The food and water had helped restore some of his strength, but exhaustion still pulled at him with insistent fingers. "Why did you save me?" he asked again, the question that had been nagging at him since she first knelt by his side. "We are supposed to be enemies." Kreshna was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the fire. When she finally answered, her voice was soft and edged with old pain. "My mother once told me that the measure of a person is not in what they do when it is easy, but in what they do when it is hard," she said. "Leaving you to die would have been easy, so I chose the hard path. Your mother sounds wise." "She was," Kreshna said, and the past tense told him everything he needed to know. They fell into silence after that, and gradually Garrett felt himself drifting back toward sleep. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Kreshna settling back against the cave wall, her knife held loosely in one hand, keeping watch over him through the night. When morning came, Garrett woke to find his fever had broken, and his mind was clearer than it had been since the attack. His shoulder still hurt abominably, but the sharp, urgent pain had dulled to a more manageable ache. He pushed himself upright carefully, testing his limits, and found he could move without feeling like he might pass out. Kreshna was nowhere to be seen, but the fire had been recently stoked and there was a fresh water skin within easy reach. Garrett drank deeply and then attempted to stand, using the cave wall for support. His legs shook with the effort, but they held, and he made his way slowly to the cave entrance to look out at the forest beyond. The morning was beautiful, with golden sunlight filtering down through the canopy and birdsong filling the air. From his vantage point, Garrett could see that they were on the side of a forested hill, with valleys and ridges stretching out in all directions. It was wild country, far from any human settlement he knew of, and he wondered how long Kreshna had been living out here in self-imposed exile. A sound made him turn, and he saw Kreshna emerging from the trees with a brace of rabbits slung over her shoulder. She stopped short when she saw him standing, surprise crossing her face before she schooled it back to neutrality. "You should not be up," she said, but there was less command in her voice this time. "I am tired of lying down," Garrett replied, "and I wanted to see the day." Kreshna studied him for a moment, as if assessing whether he would collapse, then nodded and moved past him into the cave. She set about preparing the rabbits with practiced efficiency, and Garrett watched her work with fascination. Her movements were precise and economical, wasting nothing, and within minutes she had the meat spitted over the fire. "How long have you lived out here?" he asked, lowering himself carefully to sit near the entrance. Kreshna glanced at him, then back to the fire. 3 years, she said, "since my clan cast me out." "Why would they cast you out?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she said, "I refused to participate in a raid on a human village. The elders said I had gone soft, that I was no longer fit to be counted among the clan. So they drove me into the wilderness and told me never to return." Garrett felt a pang of sympathy for her. To be cast out from one's own people, to be forced to survive alone in the wild, it was a harsh punishment for following one's conscience. "That took courage," he said quietly, "to stand up for what you believed in." Kreshna shrugged, but he could see the gesture cost her. It took foolishness. Courage would have been finding a way to change their minds. Instead, I am alone. "Not entirely alone," Garrett pointed out. "You have me as a guest, for whatever that is worth." That earned him another ghost of a smile, and he felt an unexpected warmth in his chest at the sight. They lapsed into comfortable silence as the rabbit cooked, and when it was ready, Kreshna divided the meat between them. Garrett ate slowly, savoring each bite, and tried not to think about how weak he still felt or how long it might take for him to recover enough to travel. Over the following days, a strange routine established itself. Garrett rested and slowly regained his strength while Kreshna went about her daily tasks of hunting, gathering, and maintaining her shelter. She changed his bandages twice a day, her touch becoming gentler as his wound began to heal. They spoke little at first, both wary of the fragile trust building between them, but gradually their conversations grew longer and more personal. Garrett learned that Kreshna had been born into a warrior clan that prided itself on its ferocity in battle. She had been trained from childhood to fight, to hunt, to survive in the harshest conditions. But she had also inherited her mother's compassionate nature, and as she grew older, she began to question the endless cycle of violence between orcs and humans. "My mother died in a raid," Kreshna told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "She was killed by human soldiers defending their town. I was 16. I wanted revenge, wanted to make the humans pay for what they had taken from me. But as I prepared for my first raid, I realized that somewhere there was a human child who would feel exactly as I did if I succeeded. Another mother would die, and the cycle would continue forever. So you refused, Garrett said. So I refused, she confirmed, and paid the price for it. Garrett told her about his own life, about growing up as the youngest son of a poor farmer and joining the merchant guards to earn money to send home to his family. He spoke of the roads he had traveled, the places he had seen, and the various scrapes he had gotten into over the years. Kreshna listened with apparent interest, asking questions that showed she was truly paying attention, and Garrett found himself talking more freely than he had in years. As his strength returned, Garrett began to help around the shelter. At first it was simple things like tending the fire or preparing vegetables for their meals, but gradually he took on more tasks. Kreshna protested at first, insisting he should rest, but he was stubborn, and eventually she relented. They fell into an easy partnership, working side by side to maintain the shelter and gather supplies. It was during one of these tasks that Garrett truly began to see Kreshna for who she was beyond her orcish heritage. They were by the stream that ran near her shelter, washing clothes and refilling water skins, and Kreshna was telling him about a family of foxes she had been observing in a den nearby. Her face was animated as she described the kits tumbling over each other in play, and her amber eyes sparkled with genuine delight. In that moment, she was not an orc or a warrior or an exile. She was simply a young woman who found joy in the simple beauty of the natural world, and Garrett felt something shift in his chest. He realized with a start that he was becoming attracted to her, not despite her being an orc, but simply because of who she was as a person. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Every law and custom of his people said that such feelings were wrong, that humans and orcs could never be anything but enemies. But as he watched Kreshna laugh at something he said, her tusks visible in her smile, he found he did not care what his people thought. The problem was that he had no idea if she felt anything similar toward him, and he was terrified of ruining the fragile friendship they had built by admitting his feelings. So he kept them to himself and tried to focus on recovering his strength so he could eventually return to his own people, even though the thought of leaving her filled him with unexpected sadness. Nearly 2 weeks after Garrett had first stumbled into Kreshna's territory, they were foraging for mushrooms in a shaded grove when they heard the sounds of voices echoing through the forest. Kreshna went instantly alert, her hand moving to her knife, and Garrett felt his pulse quicken with alarm. They crouched behind a fallen log and watched as a group of orc warriors made their way through the trees, clearly searching for something. "Your clan," Garrett whispered. Kreshna nodded, her face pale. "They should not be this far into the wilderness. Something must have drawn them here." As if in answer to her question, one of the orcs called out in their guttural language, and another responded with what sounded like frustration. Though Garrett did not speak the orcish tongue, he caught one word that made his blood run cold. "Human." "They are hunting for humans," Kreshna breathed. "There must have been another incident at the border." The orc warriors passed within 20 feet of their hiding spot but did not notice them. Once they had moved on, Kreshna grabbed Garrett's arm and pulled him back toward her shelter, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the underbrush. They did not speak until they were safely back in the cave, and even then, Kreshna kept her voice low. "You need to leave," she said, and there was real fear in her eyes now. "If my clan finds you here, they will kill you, and they will kill me for harboring you." Garrett wanted to argue, to tell her that he would not abandon her after all she had done for him, but he knew she was right. His presence here put her in terrible danger, and the longer he stayed, the greater the risk became. "Come with me," he said impulsively. Leave this place. We can travel to one of the southern provinces where humans and orcs are learning to coexist. You do not have to live in exile anymore." Kreshna stared at him as if he had grown a second head. "You cannot be serious. A human and an orc traveling together? We would be attacked on sight by both our peoples." "Maybe," Garrett admitted, "but maybe not. And even if we were, would it not be better than spending the rest of your life alone in these woods?" "I do not know you well enough to risk my life traveling with you," Kreshna said, but there was doubt in her voice now, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "Yes, you do," Garrett said firmly. "We have lived together for 2 weeks. We have shared meals and stories and trust. If that is not knowing someone, I do not know what is." Kreshna turned away, her shoulders tense. "You should go, now before my clan returns this way." Garrett wanted to press the issue, but he could see that she was closing herself off, retreating behind the walls she had built to protect herself from more hurt. So he gathered his few belongings, mostly the remains of his bloodied guard uniform, and prepared to leave. But before he reached the cave entrance, he turned back one more time. "Thank you," he said, "for everything. I will never forget your kindness." Kreshna did not turn to face him, but he saw her shoulders tremble slightly. "Go," she said, her voice rough, "and stay safe, Garrett Xavier." He left then, before his resolve could crumble, and made his way through the forest in the direction that would take him back toward human lands. His shoulder still ached, but he was strong enough now to travel, and he pushed himself to put distance between himself and Kreshna's shelter. But with every step, he felt like he was leaving a part of himself behind, and the feeling only grew stronger as the hours passed. By evening he had traveled several miles, but instead of feeling relief at his escape, he felt only a gnawing emptiness. He made camp in a small clearing and tried to convince himself that he had made the right choice, that leaving was what was best for both of them. But the words rang hollow even in his own mind. As darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, Garrett found himself unable to stop thinking about Kreshna alone in her cave, probably wondering if he had made it safely away from her clan's territory. He thought about the way she had smiled when she told him about the fox kits, the way she had so carefully tended his wounds, the fierce pride in her voice when she spoke of standing up to her clan. And he realized that somewhere along the way he had not just become attracted to her, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. The realization should have terrified him, but instead it filled him with a strange clarity. He had spent his whole life doing what was expected of him, following the rules his society had laid down, and where had it gotten him? He was alone, wounded and miserable, while the one person who had shown him true kindness was suffering in exile because she too had dared to defy expectations. To hell with expectations, Garrett thought. To hell with the rules that said humans and orcs could not care for each other. He had found something precious and rare with Kreshna, something worth fighting for, and he would be damned if he let it slip away without even trying to hold on to it. He stood abruptly, his decision made, and began walking back the way he had come. The forest was dark and treacherous at night, but he did not care. He had to get back to Kreshna, had to tell her how he felt even if she rejected him. At least then he would know he had tried. It took him most of the night to retrace his steps, and dawn was breaking by the time he finally glimpsed the hillside where Kreshna's cave was hidden. He was exhausted, and his shoulder throbbed with renewed pain from the exertion, but none of that mattered. He half ran, half stumbled the final distance to the cave entrance, calling her name. Kreshna emerged from the cave with her knife drawn, clearly expecting trouble, but her eyes went wide when she saw him standing there disheveled and breathing hard. "Garrett, what are you doing here?" "You should be miles away by now." "I could not leave," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I tried, but I could not do it. Kreshna, these past 2 weeks with you have been the best of my life. You are brave and kind and strong, and you see the world in a way that gives me hope there might be a better future for all of us. I know our peoples are enemies. I know that what I am about to say is probably the most foolish thing I have ever done. But I am in love with you, Kreshna, and I do not want to spend another day without you. The silence that followed his declaration was deafening. Kreshna stood frozen in the cave entrance, her knife hanging loosely in her hand, staring at him with an expression he could not read. Garrett's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for her response, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Then, slowly, Kreshna lowered her knife and took a step toward him. Then another. And another, until she was standing directly in front of him, so close he could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. "You are an idiot," she said, but there was no heat in the words. "A complete and utter idiot." "I know," Garrett agreed. "We could be killed for this. Both our peoples would see us as traitors. I know. There is no future for a human and an orc together. We would be alone forever, cast out by everyone we have ever known." "I know," Garrett said for the third time, "but I would rather be alone with you than safe without you." Kreshna made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and then she was kissing him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pulled him close. Garrett ignored the pain in his shoulder and returned the kiss with equal fervor, pouring every ounce of feeling he had into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kreshna rested her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since the moment you thanked me for helping you, even though you had every reason to fear me. You saw me as a person, not as a monster, and I have never forgotten that." They stood there holding each other as the sun rose higher over the forest, and Garrett felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was where he was meant to be, with this fierce, compassionate woman who had saved his life in more ways than one. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of harsh voices echoing through the trees. Kreshna pulled away from him with alarm, and they both turned to see a group of orc warriors emerging from the forest, with Garrett's clan clearly in their sights. At the head of the group was a massive orc male with scarred arms and a necklace made of what looked disturbingly like human teeth. "Kreshna," the orc leader said, his voice dripping with disgust. "So the rumors were true. You have been harboring a human. I did not want to believe it, but here is the proof before my eyes." "Thrakal," Kreshna said, and Garrett heard the fear in her voice. "This is not what it looks like." "Is it not?" Thrakal gestured to Garrett. "Because it looks like you have betrayed your people to warm the bed of one of our enemies." "He was injured and dying," Kreshna said, drawing herself up with dignity. "I chose mercy over cruelty. That is not betrayal." "It is exactly betrayal," Thrakal snarled. "You were cast out for your weakness, but we allowed you to live in our territory so long as you did not interfere with clan business. But this is too much. You have given aid and comfort to our enemy, and now you will both pay the price." The orc warriors behind Thrakal drew their weapons, and Garrett instinctively moved to stand in front of Kreshna even though he was unarmed and outnumbered. But Kreshna grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Run," she hissed. "I will hold them off." "I am not leaving you," Garrett said firmly. "You do not have a choice. You cannot fight them all. Neither can you." Before either of them could act, Thrakal lunged forward with surprising speed for his size, his axe raised to strike. Garrett shoved Kreshna aside and threw himself into the path of the blow, knowing it would likely kill him but unable to stand by and watch her die. But the killing blow never landed. A tremendous roar echoed through the forest, so loud it seemed to shake the very trees, and something huge crashed through the underbrush behind the orc warriors. The orcs spun around in alarm, and Garrett caught a glimpse of what looked like an enormous bear, but larger than any bear he had ever seen, with fur as black as midnight and eyes that glowed with unnatural intelligence. The beast charged into the group of orcs, scattering them like leaves before a storm. Thrackle tried to stand his ground, but the creature batted him aside with one massive paw, sending him flying into a tree trunk with a sickening crack. The other warriors fled in terror, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, and within moments the clearing was empty except for Garrett, Kreshna, and the enormous bear. The bear turned to face them, and Garrett tensed, expecting to have traded one death for another. But the creature simply regarded them with those strange, intelligent eyes for a long moment, then turned and lumbered back into the forest as quietly as it had come, leaving them stunned and shaking in its wake. What in all the hells was that? Garrett managed. Kreshna was staring after the creature with wonder on her face. A forest guardian, she breathed. I have heard stories of them, but I never thought they were real. They are said to be spirits of the forest itself, appearing only in times of great need to protect those the forest has accepted. The forest accepted us. Apparently so, Kreshna said, and she started to laugh, the sound edged with hysteria. The forest itself has declared us worthy of protection. What does that say about our peoples if even the wild things see more clearly than they do? Garrett joined her laughter, and for a moment they clung to each other and laughed until tears streamed down their faces, releasing the terror and tension of the past few minutes. When they finally calmed, they surveyed the empty clearing and the unconscious form of Thrackle slumped against the tree. We need to leave, Kreshna said seriously. When Thrackle wakes and tells the clan what happened, they will return in greater numbers, and next time we might not have a forest guardian to save us. The southern provinces, Garrett said. We can make it there if we travel quickly. I know the roads, and I have contacts who might be willing to help us. Kreshna nodded, already moving back into her cave to gather supplies. They worked together to pack everything they would need for the journey. Food, water, blankets, weapons, and the few personal possessions Kreshna wanted to keep. Within an hour they were ready to leave, and Kreshna took one last look around the cave that had been her home for 3 years. Are you sure about this? Garrett asked gently. Once we leave, there is no coming back. Kreshna turned to him with a fierce determination in her eyes. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. This place was my prison as much as my shelter. With you, I have a chance at something better, at a real life, not just survival. They left the cave behind and set out through the forest, traveling as quickly as they could while still being careful to leave no obvious trail. Kreshna led them through paths that only someone intimately familiar with the wilderness would know. And by nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and her former territory. They made camp in a sheltered hollow between 2 large boulders, and as they huddled together for warmth in the chilly night air, Garrett felt a profound sense of peace, despite the danger they faced. Kreshna fit perfectly against his side, her head resting on his good shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her and held her close. What do you think life will be like in the southern provinces? Kreshna asked quietly. Different, Garrett admitted. Not easy, certainly. But there are communities there where humans and orcs are learning to live side by side. Merchants who trade with both peoples. Farms where mixed crews work the fields. Even a few towns where the laws protect everyone regardless of what they are. It sounds like a dream. Maybe it is, Garrett said, but it is a dream worth chasing. They traveled for 9 days, moving cautiously and avoiding both orc and human settlements. The journey was hard, made harder by the fact that they had to constantly watch for pursuit, but they also found moments of unexpected joy. They discovered a hidden waterfall where they bathed and played like children, splashing each other, until they were both laughing so hard they could barely breathe. They found a meadow filled with wildflowers and spent an afternoon weaving crowns for each other, Garrett's clumsy attempts making Kreshna laugh until she had to wipe tears from her eyes. At night, they held each other close and talked about their dreams for the future. Kreshna spoke shyly of wanting a real home someday, a place with walls and a roof and a garden where she could grow vegetables. Garrett talked about opening a small inn where travelers of all races would be welcome, a place of safety and warmth in an often cold world. They both knew these dreams might never come to pass, but it felt good to imagine them anyway. On the 10th day of their journey, they crested a ridge and saw the sprawling valley below, dotted with farms and small settlements. In the distance, they could see a town, larger than anything Kreshna had ever experienced, with smoke rising from dozens of chimneys and the glint of sun on metal rooftops. "Welcome to the southern provinces," Garrett said with a smile. "This is Millbrook. It is one of the more progressive towns, with a council that includes both human and orc representatives." Kreshna stared down at the town with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Will they accept us?" "I do not know," Garrett admitted, "but we will never find out unless we try." They descended into the valley and made their way toward the town, attracting curious stares from farmers working in the fields. A few of the humans looked hostile, and Garrett saw one orc laborer actually smile and nod in greeting, which gave him hope. As they approached the town gates, 2 guards stepped forward to bar their way. One was human and one was orc, and they both looked skeptical. "State your business," the human guard said. "We are seeking refuge," Garrett replied. "We wish to petition the council for permission to settle here." The 2 guards exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to handle this unusual situation. Finally, the orc guard spoke, her voice gruff but not entirely unfriendly. "You will need to speak with Councillor Thuron. He handles such petitions. But I warn you, the council will want to know your story, and they do not take kindly to troublemakers." "We are not troublemakers," Kreshna said, speaking for the first time. "We only want a chance to live in peace." Something in her voice must have reached the guard because the orc woman's expression softened slightly. "Very well. Come with me. I will take you to Councillor Thuron." They followed the guard through the town, and Garrett was heartened to see that while they attracted attention, no one actually threatened them or tried to drive them away. The town was clearly more diverse than the places he had grown up in, with humans, orcs, and even a few dwarves and elves moving about the streets conducting business and going about their daily lives. Councillor Thuron turned out to be a middle-aged human man with kind eyes and graying hair. He listened intently as Garrett and Kreshna told their story, interrupting only occasionally to ask clarifying questions. When they had finished, he sat back in his chair and regarded them thoughtfully. "Your tale is remarkable," he said at last, "and I believe you are telling the truth. The question is what to do about it. You understand that accepting you both into our community could cause complications. There will be those who object on both sides, who see your relationship as unnatural or wrong." "We understand," Garrett said. "But we are willing to work hard to prove ourselves valuable members of the community. We ask only for a chance." Councillor Thuron nodded slowly. "I will bring your petition before the full council. In the meantime, you may stay at the community hall. It is not luxurious, but it will provide shelter while we deliberate." Over the next 3 days, Garrett and Kreshna waited anxiously for the council's decision. They stayed in a small room in the community hall, and Garrett used the time to reconnect with an old friend who lived in the town, a fellow former guard named Gideon Xander who had settled here years ago. Gideon and his wife, an orc woman named Shara, welcomed them warmly and shared their own story of finding acceptance in Millbrook. It was not easy at first, Shara admitted as they sat together over dinner one evening. Many people treated us with suspicion. But we kept our heads down, worked hard, and slowly people began to see us as individuals rather than symbols. Now most of the town accepts us, and those who do not at least leave us in peace. How long did it take? Kreshna asked. Years, Gideon said honestly. But it was worth every moment of struggle. We have built a good life here, and our children will grow up in a world where they are not forced to choose between their two heritages. The mention of children made Kreshna and Garrett exchange glances, and Garrett felt his face heat slightly. They had not talked about the future in such concrete terms, but the thought of building a family with Kreshna filled him with a warmth that surprised him with its intensity. On the third day, they were summoned before the council. The council chamber was a large circular room with seats arranged in a semicircle facing a central podium where Garrett and Kreshna stood. There were 12 council members in total, 6 humans and 6 orcs, and they all regarded the petitioners with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Councillor Thuron stood and addressed the room. We have before us Garrett Xavier, a human, and Kreshna, an orc, who petitioned for the right to settle in Millbrook. They have told us their story, and we must now decide whether to grant their request. The floor is open for discussion. What followed was a lengthy debate that ranged from supportive to hostile. Some council members spoke passionately in favor of accepting them, citing the town's commitment to peaceful coexistence between the races. Others worried about setting a precedent that might encourage other refugees or outcasts to come seeking sanctuary, potentially overwhelming the town's resources. A few simply seemed uncomfortable with the idea of a romantic relationship between a human and an orc, though they couched their objections in more diplomatic language. Through it all, Garrett and Kreshna stood together, their hands clasped tightly, presenting a united front. When it seemed the debate might go against them, Kreshna asked permission to speak, and Councillor Thuron granted it. "Honored Council," she began, her voice clear and strong despite her obvious nervousness. "I understand your concerns. I do not come to you as a perfect person with no past. I am an exile from my clan, cast out because I refuse to participate in violence against your people. Garrett is a man who risked everything to return to someone his society told him was his enemy. We are both imperfect, but we are also both committed to building something better than the world we were born into." She paused and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each council member in turn. "You have built something remarkable here in Millbrook. A place where different peoples can live together in peace. But that peace is meaningless if it only extends to those who were lucky enough to be born in the right place. True peace means opening your doors to those who seek it, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult." There was silence in the chamber when she finished, and then one of the orc council members, an older female with graying hair, spoke up. "The young woman speaks wisdom beyond her years. I vote to accept their petition." One by one the other council members added their votes, and when the tally was complete, 9 had voted in favor and only 3 against. Councillor Thuron smiled broadly and nodded to Garrett and Kreshna. "The council has spoken. You are granted permission to settle in Millbrook with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. Welcome to your new home." The relief that washed over Garrett was so intense he felt his knees weaken, and beside him Kreshna let out a shaky breath. They thanked the council profusely and left the chamber in a daze, barely able to believe their good fortune. Over the following weeks, they worked to establish themselves in the community. Gideon helped Garrett find work with the town guard, a position that suited his skills and experience. Kreshna, with her knowledge of hunting and wilderness survival, was hired to help train scouts and provide game for the market. They saved every copper they earned, determined to one day fulfill their dream of owning their own home. Life was not without its challenges. Some townspeople made their disapproval clear through cold stares or muttered comments, and there were a few incidents where someone deliberately tried to make their lives difficult. But for every person who rejected them, there were two more who welcomed them or at least treated them with basic courtesy. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a life in Millbrook. 6 months after their arrival, Garrett used their savings to purchase a small plot of land on the outskirts of town, with a modest cottage that needed considerable repair, but had good bones. They spent their spare time fixing it up, working side by side to patch the roof, repair the walls, and clear the land for a garden. Kreshna proved to have a gift for growing things, and by summer, their garden was flourishing with vegetables and herbs. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cottage watching the sun set over the valley, Garrett turned to Kreshna and found her already looking at him with a soft expression on her face. "I have something I want to ask you," he said, his heart pounding with nervousness. "Yes?" Kreshna prompted, her amber eyes curious. Garrett reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden ring he had carved himself, inlaid with a piece of polished green stone that reminded him of her skin. It was not much compared to the elaborate jewelry wealthy humans exchanged, but he had poured his heart into crafting it. "Kreshna," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved my life in that forest, but more than that, you gave my life meaning. Every day with you is a gift I never thought I would receive. I know our peoples may never fully accept us, and I know we will face challenges for the rest of our lives. But I cannot imagine facing those challenges with anyone but you by my side. Will you marry me?" Kreshna stared at the ring, then at him, and tears began streaming down her green cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course I will marry you, you foolish, wonderful man." Garrett slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt and joy. They held each other as the stars emerged overhead. Two souls from different worlds who had found in each other a home more real than any place could ever be. They were married 3 months later in a small ceremony attended by their friends and supporters from the community. Gideon stood as Garrett's witness, while Shara stood for Kreshna. Counselor Thuron officiated, speaking movingly about the power of love to bridge even the deepest divides. When Garrett and Kreshna exchanged their vows, there was not a dry eye in the gathering. "I vow to love you in both the easy moments and the hard ones," Garrett said, his voice clear and steady. "To stand beside you against whatever challenges we face, and to build with you a future worthy of the courage you showed when you saved a dying human in the forest." Kreshna's voice shook slightly, but her words were no less powerful. "I vow to be your partner, your companion, and your love for all my days, to never let fear or prejudice dim the light we have found together, and to fight for the world we both believe is possible." When they kissed as husband and wife, their friends cheered, and Garrett felt a sense of completeness he had never known before. This was what he had been searching for his whole life without knowing it, this feeling of being exactly where he belonged with exactly the right person. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. There were still those who disapproved of their union, and occasionally they faced active hostility from those who clung to old hatreds. But they weathered each storm together, their love growing stronger rather than weaker in the face of adversity. 2 years after their wedding, Kreshna gave birth to a daughter. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, as neither human nor orc midwives were entirely certain how to handle a mixed heritage child. But in the end, their daughter entered the world healthy and screaming, with her mother's green-tinged skin and her father's brown eyes, and they named her Hope. Holding his daughter for the first time, Garrett felt tears stream down his face as he marveled at the tiny, perfect creature they had created. She was living proof that humans and orcs were not so different after all, that love could transcend the artificial boundaries their peoples had drawn. She represented everything they had fought for, everything they believed the world could be. "She is beautiful," Kreshna whispered from the bed, exhausted but glowing with joy. "She is perfect," Garrett agreed, "and she will grow up in a world that is better than the one we knew." Over the years, their family grew. Hope was joined by a son they named Thomas, and then another daughter named Arya. Each child was unique, blending human and orc features in different ways, but all were loved fiercely by their parents and eventually accepted by the community. The children of Millbrook grew up playing together without regard for who was human and who was orc, and gradually the old prejudices began to fade. Garrett and Kreshna's cottage became a gathering place for others in mixed relationships, or for those who simply believed in a better future. They offered advice, support, and sometimes just a listening ear to people struggling to reconcile love with societal expectations. Their story became something of a legend in the southern provinces, a tale of hope that was told and retold until it took on a life of its own. 15 years after that fateful day when Garrett had torn his own shirt to wash the blood from an orc girl's face, he found himself once again standing with Kreshna on the porch of their cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Their children were inside, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to set the table, and the garden was lush with late summer vegetables. "You ever think about how different our lives might have been?" Kreshna asked, leaning against him with comfortable familiarity. "Sometimes," Garrett admitted. "If those bandits had killed me, or if you had left me to die in the forest, or if we had not had the courage to fight for what we wanted, our whole lives balanced on such small moments. I am glad we made the choices we did," Kreshna said softly. "Even knowing all the hardship it would bring, I would choose this life with you 1,000 times over." "As would I," Garrett said, turning to kiss her forehead. "You are still the bravest person I know, Kreshna. You saved my life that day in the forest, but you also showed me what it means to truly live, to follow your conscience even when it costs you everything, to choose compassion over cruelty, love over hate. I am a better man because of you." "And I am a better woman because of you," Kreshna replied. "You looked at me and saw a person, not a monster. You gave me hope when I had lost it, and you gave me a family when I thought I would spend my life alone. Everything good in my life came from the moment I chose to help you." They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky. Inside, they could hear their children laughing, the sound of the life they had built together against all odds. It was not a perfect life, but it was theirs, earned through courage and love and stubborn determination to create something better than what had come before. "Mother, Father, dinner is ready," Hope called from inside, and they could hear the twins arguing about who had done more work to prepare it. Garrett and Kreshna smiled at each other, these two people from different worlds who had found a home in each other's hearts. Hand in hand, they went inside to join their children, to share a meal and stories and laughter, to be a family. And in that simple moment, surrounded by the people they loved most in the world, they knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Every hardship endured had led them to this place of peace and belonging. The story of how a human guard and an orc exile had defied their peoples to build a life together would be told for generations to come, inspiring others to reach across divides and choose understanding over fear. But for Garrett and Kreshna, the story was simply their lives, lived one day at a time with love and courage and hope for a better tomorrow. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.